Hey everyone, welcome back to the Data Visualization with D3 and React video tutorial series. In this video we're going to complete our bar chart by adding bars to it. If you recall, in the last video we had an SVG canvas and we added some axes, and in this video of course we'll complete the chart, at least a very basic simple bar chart. But unfortunately, and this might annoy some of you, we're going to go back and start from the beginning. We're going to add the SVG one more time, and we're going to add the axes one more time. And the reason I've decided to do that is because after looking at my code last time, I realized there's probably a better way that we can do this where I guess things are a little bit easier to deal with, and the code should be a little bit better organized. But I also think that it behooves all of us to do these things as many times as we can without getting completely burned out, so that we can build up that sort of muscle memory and conditioning that allows us to have a more intuitive sense of what works and what doesn't when using a challenging library like D3. But if you really don't want to do that again and you want to skip to the end, or not the end, but to the part where we add the bars, feel free to do that. But for those of you who are going to continue with me from the beginning, know that I've created some boilerplate code. I used Create React app to set up a starter project so that as you follow along with this tutorial, you can add files for the individual examples that we work on. So if you go to my GitHub and you go to this repository, and I'll put that URL in the video description, you can clone this repository, so get it ready for cloning by getting the URL, and then clone it. I'm just going to call mine React D3. You can call yours whatever you like. All right, navigate into that directory and install your dependencies. And we'll bring our folder into our workspace. If you check out your package.json file, you can see that not only do you have the D3 dependency, but also React router DOM. And this is because we're going to create a multi-page app that has different pages for different D3 examples. So right now, if you start up your project, let's create React app, so you can just use npm start. All right, and that should be loading up pretty quickly. You see it's your typical create React app homepage. I've just changed the title and I've added a link to the first example we're going to work on, which today is the bar chart example. So if you click on that, you see all you've got is your header. All right, we don't have anything else yet. So what we can do is first, since we're going to be adding pages over time, including, well, today we've already got the page we're going to work on, which is barchart.jsx, but we don't have a style sheet associated with this file. And I'd like to use an individual style sheet for all page styles. So in the pages folder, please create a styles folder. And then for the barchart.jsx file, we need a style sheet that corresponds to it. So create a new file in that styles folder called barchart.css. And then in your barchart.jsx file, bring that in. All right, now go into your components folder and create a new file, a new component. It's going to be called chart.jsx, and we'll need a corresponding style sheet. So in the styles folder for your components, which are your component styles, add a file called chart.css. All right, so chart.jsx, bring in React. Bring in your style sheet. And actually in this file we are going to use two hooks. Right? One will be use effect and the other will be use ref. And then when we bring in our chart component to our bar chart file, we want to know that it works, so we'll put in some test text. Alright, so into your bar chart file, import your chart component. And I'm going to put it in under the header, but we'd like to create a wrapper for the body of the page. I mean, if you take a look at the page now, all this white space is your main body. So we'll create a div with a class name barChartBody, and inside of that div we'll put our chart component. Okay, and if you take a look at your page, you can see that the component is working. Alright, so in chart.jsx we don't need that anymore. Alright, now let's set up our canvas in one way. We'd like to use this div to show where our canvas is going to be. So what we can do is go into chart.css, use the canvas class selector, give our canvas a width of, let's say, 750 pixels and a height of 500 pixels to keep that 3:2 ratio of width to height that we used last time. Our dimensions are a little bit different. Let's add a background color. We'll say beige like we did last time. Alright, and if you check out your page, you can see that you've got that div showing up here. Alright, we can move it over to the center horizontally and to the center vertically. Alright, just by manipulating our chart, the div that wraps our chart, with class name barChartBody. So in barchart.css, use that class selector. Alright, and we'll use Flexbox here. Set it to 90% of the viewport height. That way we take into account the actual header at the top. We don't end up with an annoying vertical scroll bar. Okay, so if you take a look at your page now, it's moved down to the center of the page for the most part, but we need it moved over horizontally as well. So that means we can just go over to our chart.css component and use margin auto. Okay, and that moves things over, just like that. Okay, we want this to be mobile responsive as well. If you take a look now by opening up your dev tools, you can see that things just don't look that great here. Alright, so what we can do is use a media query. Alright, so we can say that when the screen size is smaller than 750 pixels, and it will be for an iPhone, for example, then you'll reduce the canvas size to 350 pixels. Alright, so if you take a look now at your page, sometimes you have to refresh it to get things to line up. Now it's centered. It's still got a little bit of annoying scroll horizontally. Okay, so horizontally it's fine. It's got that 350 pixel setting, but vertically it's no good. We want this to be mobile responsive completely. So going back to your code, rather than using a fixed height here, we can just say auto. Actually, sorry. I got ahead of myself here. So before we do all of that, we actually have to use SVG. So go back to your chart.jsx file. And what we're going to do, remember last time we added our SVG element using JavaScript in D3. This time we're going to add a pure SVG element to our JSX. So go ahead and define that now. Now remember the properties that we need to worry about. We've got view box. All right, we've got the top left corner at x equals 0, y equals 0. We'll set the x dimensions, or the width of it, to be 750 and the y to be 500. We use the property preserve aspect ratio. Remember our setting last time? Be careful where your capital letters are. That's important, otherwise it won't work. We'll set the width equal to 100% as well as the height. This is for mobile responsiveness. All right, so now go back. Well, first of all, take a look at your page. Nothing has changed. All right, but if we go back to chart.css, and now we set the height here to auto. All right, and we take a look at our page. Now we've got that mobile responsiveness we were hoping for. Not only is it 350 pixels in the horizontal direction, it's adjusted according to the right ratio, the aspect ratio, to the right height, and everything's centered. Okay, so that's good. So let's go back to the code. Sorry, I did that again. I keep hitting the wrong button. What I'm doing is I'm switching back and forth between screens using OBS, and sometimes if you hit the wrong button, gets you into trouble. All right, so now back to our chart.jsx file. All right, we have one more property we need to worry about here. And actually, first what I'd like to do is I'd like to go into the chart.css file and get rid of the background color from the div. And if you do that and you take a look at your page, you see that it's all gone away here. And we'll add the background color to the SVG element using the style property. Okay, so back to your page, we're back in business. All right, and recall last time for the canvas we used the useRef hook in order to attach or to be able to manipulate that specific DOM node that we were interested in. All right, and then our SVG took ref property, the value of canvas. All right, so if you didn't follow along with that last time, please go back and take a look at that. Or you can just look up useRef at the React.js documentation page. All right, so we need to now add our axes. So what we'll do is we'll use useEffect, right, so that when our component mounts, we run certain functions. Jeez. All right, so the first thing we'll do is we will define our SVG in JavaScript or in D3. Remember, the current property of the useRef object allows us to manipulate that DOM node. All right, and realize here we're getting an error, and that means that we haven't imported D3 like we should have. All right. So the first thing we're going to need is a function that adds our axes. All right, so you can make a function called addAxes and invoke it. And we're invoking it before we've actually created it. And we're going to pass the SVG as our parameter to the function. But for now, since we're getting this error, go ahead and comment it out. And then we'll go down below and we will create our addAxes function. Don't forget to pass your SVG element to it. All right, so the first thing we need to do is define our X scale. So remember, we did that last time. And because we want a one-to-one correspondence with the values in our X data, and the array that holds all of our X values, with the labels that get painted onto the axis or below the axis, we'll use the D3 function scale band. All right. And we chain on the domain function. And remember, this took in as its parameter an array with two values. The low value would be, well, actually, in this case, we're passing in an array. Sorry, it doesn't take in just two values. It has all of the values that need to be displayed on as labels underneath your tick marks, because that's how scale band works. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass in an array of values that we get from bar chart, right? But we need to pass those in as props. Remember, those are these values here. So let's go ahead and set up our chart with the appropriate props. So first, the width or the dimensions of the X direction we'll set equal to 750. Y-dim would be the height of our y-axis, so y-dim equals, these are the dimensions of the chart, by the way, not of the canvas. That'll be 500. All right, we'll create some margins now and we'll use them later. All right, so we'll have the top at 80 pixels, or just 80, and the bottom at 80, left. And remember, we're keeping that 3:2 ratio of horizontal to vertical, so these will be 120, left and right. Also, we're going to pass in our data. So the first prop will be, let's call it X data, and we'll pass in the months array. And then the second one will be Y data, and we'll pass in the Y values array. These here. Okay, so back to your chart.jsx file. We need to make sure we're using those props. All right, so what did we have? We had xdim, ydim, margin, X data, and Y data. All right, now when you use effect, it's good to have a dependency array attached to it. That way, when your props are updated, it updates your page so that you can remount those components, or the page component itself. So bring those down into your dependency array. Good. All right, so back to adding our axes. Remember, our domain was going to be just all of the X values, which are contained in the array X data. And then our range function takes in an array as well with high and low values. So if we go back to our page, right, so for now we just want our axis to stretch from the extreme left side of the canvas to the extreme right hand side. So for our range we'll go from, and this left side corresponds to x equals 0. So we'll go from 0. So you see here in the domain input, the range input, I've given the first element of the 2-element array a value of 0. The other value will be the x value that corresponds to the extreme right hand side of this SVG with respect to the beginning, which was 0. So this will be x dim, the x dimension. Alright, so we can put that here. Now we define our x-axis, and we use the D3 function axis bottom because the x-axis is on the bottom. We pass in xScale as a parameter, and now we append a group element to our SVG so that we can add our axes, or our axis, our x-axis. So we use svg.append, and we're going to append a group element. We use the call function to get our x-axis. Okay, and then so that we can see how our SVG looks, we need to make sure that our function is being properly invoked, and that was done. Alright, now let's take a look at our page. Now we've got the x-axis and it does stretch all the way across the canvas. We don't want it up here at the top, we want to move it down. So how can we do that? Well, if you recall from last time, underneath of the call function we chained on an attribute function, and we used a transform attribute and the translate function, which means a horizontal or vertical shift. Right, we don't want to translate it at all in the x direction, so we'll leave that 0. But we'd like to shift it downward by, at least in the beginning, naively, by an amount equal to, say, the y-axis, right? So that would be y dim. Right, and if we go back to our page, right, we can see that that's too far. So we need to bring it back up a little bit. Right, so what we can do is we could subtract out, say, a value equal to the top margin, right? So we can say minus 80. Remember, by subtracting values in the y direction, we're moving it upwards because positive y is downwards. All right, and if we go back to our page, we can see that at least vertically it's positioned all right for now. We'd like to add in some margins on both the left and the right hand side, and eventually at the top and bottom as well. So let's go ahead and do that now. So go back to your code. If you go down to your div, right, we can expand our x and y values in the view box. All right, so now we have it fixed at the width of the canvas, but we'd like to add in the margins as well. So what we can do is say x dim. Sorry, I've got to change things here. All right, we'll use a template literal. All right, so we've added in the margins horizontally. All right, and then we'll also do it for the vertical dimension as well. All right, and let's see where we're at. Take a look at your page. So things don't look that great. The first thing we'd like to do is center the x-axis, right? So you can guess that first we'd like to move it over from the left-hand side an amount at least equal to the left margin. All right, so if you go up to X scale, instead of having it 0 here, we can say margin.left. Okay, and if you go back to your page, you can see that we've moved the axis over an amount equal to the left margin. But remember, the left side and the right side of the axis are given by starting and ending points. Now, if we leave the ending point here, what it was before, we've compressed our axis, right? Which we don't want to do. So if we go back and adjust our ending point, we can just add margin.left. All right, and if we go back to our page, our axis is centered. Okay. So, hold on just a sec. Looks like there's someone at the door. I'm going to pause the video. Hopefully you won't notice it too much. Okay, so hopefully that seemed seamless. So, looking here at our canvas and our axis, it seems like everything's been compressed. And the one thing we did is we added margins, but we didn't increase the size of our canvas wrapper, right? Remember, our canvas, our SVG element itself is mobile responsive, so if we increase the size of the wrapper, the SVG element will expand to fill it. So if we go to our chart.css file, right, we can increase the size of our canvas wrapper to accommodate the changes we've made. Now remember, we added, for the widths, we've added 120 for the left margin and 120 for the right margin, making a total of 240. So if we add 240 to the width, right, we get 990. All right, and then if we go back to our page, we can see that yes, we have a larger canvas, but at least we're keeping the dimensions of the axis that we wanted it to have. Okay, so back to the code. All right, so we've added the x-axis. All right, now we would like to add the y-axis. And by the way, before we subtracted out the top margin just so that we could move the x-axis up, but we don't need to do that anymore now that we've added in the margin, so you can get rid of that. All right, and if you take a look now at your page, you can see that it's moved your axis down to a better position. All right, so let's finish adding our axes. We'll do the y-axis now. So, as with the x-axis, we create a y-scale. And this time we use scale linear, right, the scale linear function. All right, and that's because if you think about it, if you look at your y values here, if we just left them as they were and we tried to set up our bars using these heights, I mean, you have here 9 pixels as your largest bar height and 1 as your smallest. That means we'd have a very meaningless bar chart, right? Our bars would be so small to make it ridiculous. So what we need to do is scale these up to make them proportionate with the y-axis, right? So that they're stretched out and they fill up the screen in a way that we need them to. So that's what the y scale is going to do for us, and that's why we use scale linear. We don't want to have a one-to-one correspondence. We want to scale up the values. All right, by the way, I didn't get rid of that semicolon, and you should too. So we use the domain function, right? And remember that this is going to be from the lowest to the highest value. And since our y values here range between 1 and 9, from 0 to 10 would be a nice range, but let's just go 0 to the maximum value, which would be 9. So we can say from 0 to d3.max, and that will get the max value of the y data array. We also need to chain on the range function. Now for here, naively, we can just think of making the length of this axis equal to, well, we do want the length to be equal to y dim, right? So we can use our starting point as 0 and our ending point as a value equal to y dim. All right, and then when we create our y-axis and call it, so first let's create the y-axis. This time we use axis left. We pass in y scale. Now we append a group element to our SVG. Just like before, we use the call function to add the y-axis. Okay, so if you go over to your page now, you see the y-axis. It's pushed over up against the well, it's pushed off of the left-hand side for the most part. We need to move it over an amount equal to the left margin, so we can do that easily. So we'll use the transform attribute and translate again. All right, so this time we're moving it in the x direction, so we'll say margin.left, and then, of course, nothing in the vertical direction. So now if you look at your page, you can see that the y-axis is connected where it should be with the x-axis down here. But unfortunately, it's being pushed off of the canvas up here a little bit. So we need to move everything down, and we probably want to move it down an amount equal to the top margin. All right, that means we need to move not only the y-axis, but also the x-axis. All right, so back to your code. First, move the y-axis down. All right, so if you look at the y scale, rather than starting from 0, we can start from margin.top. Actually, let's not do that yet. Let's start here at margin.top. And if you take a look at your page now, we are moved down. So now let's just move the x-axis down. So if we go up to x scale, so not y dim, but y dim plus margin dot top. Okay, and that moves our x-axis down. And you may have noticed that rather than going from 0 to 9 upwards, we're going from 9 to 0. Right? So we need to reverse this. So if we go back to our y scale, rather than starting at 0, we want to end at 0. So we'll start at y dim and we'll end at 0. Okay, and then if we go back to our page, that fixes our y-axis here. So we're going from 0 to 9. Good. So now we can add our bars. All right, and to add our bars, we are going to use, for sure we're going to use X scale, and maybe in another video when we do more stuff, we might have to use the Y scale as well. So rather than have these both scoped to the add axes function, let's move them outside and give them a larger scope. So first take add axes, sorry, X scale. All right, put that just below the add axes function. All right, and then we'll do the same thing with Y scale. Okay, and if you go back to your page, you can see that everything's fine. All right, good. So now we'll create a function and we'll call it add bars. We'll also pass the SVG element to it. Again, we're getting an error, so for now, comment it out until we define it. And underneath add axes, create a function called add bars. All right, so the first thing we'll need to do is we'll need to create a scale function that takes it takes our y values and it scales them up for the rectangles. We did that with the axis. We'll have to do it for the rectangles as well. So we'll create a function called linear scale, and we'll use d3.scaleLinear again because we're scaling things up in a linear fashion. And this time our domain. All right, so what we're doing here, right, is we are just a second here. Okay, so what we're doing here with the linear scale is we're going from our lowest value in our y values array. So if you look again, just like we did before, right, it would be 1, but we can just go from 0. All right, we want to stretch our rectangles from 0 rather than 1, otherwise the top of our lowest value will be equal with the x-axis and it won't look good. So we'll go from 0 and then we'll go up to the maximum value of our y data. And then again, we'll go from 0, naively 0 to the height of the axis. And it's not height, it was ydim, excuse me. And then we need to apply this linear scale function to all of the values in y data, so we can use the map function for that. So we'll call our result scaled y data, and we'll use ydata.map. We apply the linear scale function to each y value. All right, good. So now what we need to do is append our rectangles. So this might not seem intuitive at all, and that makes sense, but this is a weird thing about SVG. In order to do stuff to all the rectangles, you have to select all the rectangles. But at this point, we don't have any rectangles there, but still you have to say that you're selecting all the rectangles. So you can say svg.select all. And then we use the data function, and the data that we're going to pass is our scaled y data. We invoke the enter function. This is just something that we do with SVG when we create these bar charts. And then now you can append rectangles. All right, so the first thing we need to consider is the width of a rectangle. All right, and we could take a look at, for example, if you look at the width of our x-axis is going to be 750 pixels, right? And we have, what here, 12 values. We could do the calculation ourselves and calculate the width of each rectangle, but actually D3 takes care of that for us by using our X scale that we set up earlier. Right, so what you can do here is you can just say x scale, and since we use the scale band function, we use the function that goes along with it, bandwidth, and it calculates it for us. All right, so that's nice. All right, now think about the height. Now, the height of each rectangle is going to be different. So we're going to need a function here that takes that into account. So for each data point in your scaled Y data set or array, we want to return the value, right? Remember, these values are all scaled up. Don't forget to add your comma after you define the height attribute. Now, if you're wondering what this is going to look like, what you can do now, and let's go up here to your scaled Y data function. Underneath it, let's console log scaled Y data. Okay, and then if you go to your page and you open up your console, stupid me, we've got to invoke our function first. So go back to your the useEffect method and uncomment your add bars function. Okay, now go back to your page, right? And of course you see this bar here, but other than that, if you look at the console, right, you see that, for example, at index number 4, your scaled Y value, because that's what we logged to the console, is 500. Okay, and that should correspond with the 5th value in your Y data array, right? So if you go back to barchart.jsx, you can see that 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. At index number 4, you have your maximum value, right? Which is 9 here, but it should scale up to the length of your y-axis, which in our case is 500. And if you see here, that's what it does. So our scaled y values are good. So now again, you have this bar here, and you can see that if you shifted it downward, it might just line up exactly with the y-axis if you shifted it down to right here. And if it does, that means you're seeing the bar with the maximum height, which corresponds to this value here. But why would you be seeing just that bar, not the rest of the bars? Well, the easy answer is, and it's not too easy if you don't know, if you don't have any experience with D3, but I mean the basic answer is that all of these bars are lined up on top of each other. And of course, the largest one is going to cover up all of the others. So we have to find a way to spread these out across the chart. And of course, we want them to start from the y-axis, not all the way over here. So we'll have to take care of that as well. So back to your code. All right, so everything's set up so far so good. Well, maybe. So underneath here, we're going to have to take care of our x attribute. So set that up now. And this is going to be a function of both d and the index. All right, so for each value in our scaled y data set, all right, what we need to do is we need to add a rectangle and move it with respect to the previously added rectangle so that they sit apart. Okay, so you could just say, look here at your x data, right, which are months, right, and you can say each rectangle is represented by x data of I. And I need a return here. Okay, so that would be fine if these values were numbers, right? But they're not. Sorry, these values here in your X data array, which is the months. So we need to use our xScale function to help us take care of that. So what we do is we actually pass this in as a parameter to xScale. Okay, now if you take a look at your page, you can see you've got your bars. All right. Of course, they're not where they should be. First of all, you can see that you don't want them up here at the top of the chart, right? If nothing else, right, you'd like it so that they were fitting within 9 and 0 on the y-axis and then inverted. So first, let's just shift them down so that they all fit within the y-axis values. Okay, so go back to your code. All right, so we'll use the y attribute. And this is also a function. Actually, no, it's not. Excuse me. All right, and we want to move these down. So we want them to start at margin.top. Okay, now if you take a look at your page, they are moved down and they're where we want them to be. They're within the range 0 to 9 on the y-axis. But now what we need is we need this bar, which has a height of 5, to go from 0 to 5. And we need this bar, which has a height of 6, to go from 0 to 6. So how can we make that happen? Right. Well, one thing we can do is we can say let the bar start from, and that will be right here, y dim, right? And then go back up here, right? So in this case it would be to 5, right? So we'd be subtracting the height of the bar, which is 5. All right, so let's play around a little bit here and see if we can make this happen. So what if we say margin top plus, actually we need this to be for each individual bar, so let's go back up here and we'll say the height will be y dim minus the height of a bar. Actually no, that's wrong. Alright, so actually with y we need to use a function here. So it'll be a function of the data points. Alright, so again, and sorry, I realized you were not looking at the code. So for the y attribute before, if you recall, and I'll just undo what I just did because you didn't see it. All right, before we had everything shifted down by a value equal to the top margin, right? But what we need to use is a function here. All right, so and that takes in the data points and transforms them. So what we'll return here, and again we need margin.top, right? But if you look at your page again, right, we need to shift it more, right? So if this is the bottom, right, this is where the y starts. We want to move this down to here, and then we want to subtract out the height of the bar, right? So that would look like this. So it's margin.top plus the height of the y-axis, and then you subtract out the height of a bar, which is d. Okay, and now if you take a look at your page, you see that our bars are okay. Now if you don't like them being bunched up on top of each other like this, what you can do is you can go back to your X scale and you can use the padding function. Alright, and this takes values between 0 and 1. Okay, and for example, if you use 0.2 or 0.3, that's 20 or 30% the width of a bar, and that's how big of a gap you'll have between the bars. So I'll use 10% or 0.1. Okay, and if we take a look at our page now, you can see we've got a nice width between the bars. And if I don't want to keep this color for the bars, I can change that as well. All right, so we can use the fill attribute, and we can put in whatever color we like. I like to use Dodger blue, even though I don't like the Dodgers. Alright, if you take a look at your page, you've got different colored bars now. Alright, and if you want to change if you want to add a border to the rectangles, because if you look here, the rectangles don't have borders, you can use the stroke property or stroke attribute. And then we'll say just black. Okay, so now if you take a look at your bar or your chart, you've got these black borders around the rectangles. Alright, so we're almost there. Maybe we want to add a title to this graph that tells us something about what the data means. Like for example, if this was a town in a relatively cold part of the world, then for each month, these numbers could represent the average daily temperature. Right, which would be weird to have the maximum temperature in May and then the coldest temperature in June, but why not? Maybe they're suffering from the effects of global warming. All right, so if we want to add text, we can create a function called add text. All right, and again, to avoid errors for now, let's go ahead and comment that out. Underneath your add bars function, create a function called add text. Right, again, we need to pass the SVG to it. All right, and we'll just say SVG dot append text. And then there's actually a text property that we can use where we can explicitly define our text. So let's say our text will be average daily temperature in Coldville. Alright, so now if you take a look, and first we should do is invoke our function. So let's do that first. So now if you take a look at your page, you can see the text kind of poking down here. And remember, without any X and Y settings, it's going to be somewhere up here at the top left corner. So what we can do is we can move it over to the center here, which would be the total width of the canvas divided by 2. So that's margin left plus the length of the x-axis plus margin right. And so let's go back to the code. And so here we can say dot attribute x, and then we'll say margin dot left plus margin dot right plus xdim. Right, all of that divided by 2. Alright, now if we take a look at our page, you can see the text has been shifted over, but we also need to bring it down. Alright, so maybe we want to bring it down about half the length of the margin, so somewhere around here, so we can do that. Alright, so for our y attribute, we can say margin.top divided by 2. Alright, so go back to your page, and you can see that we do have the text, but we wanted it to be centered in the middle. It is centered if you think about the text anchor as being attached to the first character, but we want the text anchor to be attached to the middle part so that we can shift this whole thing over to the center. So what we can do is right below text, we can use the text anchor attribute and middle. Okay, and if you go back to your page, then the text is in the middle, so that's okay. Alright, so now we don't really need any text down here to talk about what's going on with the x-axis. I think it's pretty clear just from the labels. Alright, and by the way, if we didn't want these labels to be so close to each other over here they're spaced far enough apart, but here they're starting to get closer, and it just gives you this kind of uneven feeling looking at it. Remember, like last time, we could rotate these text labels down by, say, 45 degrees. So if you go back to your code and go up to where we added the axes, so here we can use select all text. Right, and remember, we wanted to use a text anchor that was attached to the beginning of each text string. Alright, so if you go back to your page, you can see that all of the labels have been moved over, so the tick marks are right above the first character. Alright, and then from here we can just apply a simple rotation. And that was 45 degrees. Alright, so if you go back to your page, the labels are rotated. I think this is sufficient. We don't really need to move them around too much. I think they're okay where they're at. Okay, so now let's get some text here for the y-axis, because these numbers aren't self-explanatory. We need to put in some text, something like temperature in Celsius, right? So go back to your code, and in your add text function, we'll add another text object. All right, we'll make that text temperature in Celsius. And let's just so we can see it. If you look now, you can barely see something up here, right? So let's try to bring it a little bit more onto the screen just so we have a better idea of where things are at. So we'll say the x attribute, let's just say 5 pixels. All right, and let y be the same. Okay, so if you take a look at your page, you can see the text now. All right, now what we'd like to do is perform a rotation. All right, so it wouldn't be a positive rotation this way, it would be a negative rotation this way. And if we do that, we'd like to rotate it about a value right about here. Actually, here this is at x equals 5, right? And y equals 5. So we'd like to rotate it around a point that was margin.left divided by 2, and I think that would be all right. Let's give it a try. So go back to your code. So first of all, we can set these to 0 again for now. Alright, so for the rotate function, we can give it 3 values. Right, we can give it the rotation, which in this case is going to be minus 90 degrees. We can give it the center of rotation x value, which would be, as we said we wanted it, margin dot left divided by 2. Right, and margin dot top divided by 2. Okay, so if you take a look now at your page, right, you can see that the text has been rotated, but it's still not in a good position. So how can we move it over here and bring it down here? Well, first of all, I'd like it to be lined up to where it's right in the middle of the canvas, vertically speaking. So we can just add top margin plus y-axis length plus bottom margin. All right. But remember, we're not shifting it in the positive y direction with respect to the rotated coordinate system that this new text, or this text, finds itself in. This will be negative y, this will be positive y, right? This will be negative x, and this will be positive x. All right, so back to your code. So we're shifting it in the x direction negatively. All right, margin dot top plus margin dot bottom plus y dim, right, and all of that divided by 2. All right, so if you go to your page, all right, you can see that we moved it down. Okay, again, we probably want this text anchor to be centered. All right, so let's go back. That doesn't look good. All right, take a look. We've somehow shifted it further down. I was hoping that we would shift it back up here. All right, but instead of worrying about that too much now, let's just undo what we just did. Get rid of that for now. All right, and think about moving it closer to the y-axis, right? So that would be, say, margin left divided by 2, right? And of course that's in the positive y direction. So if we go back to here, we can just say margin dot left divided by 2. All right, and there it is. Okay, so if you take a look, it's not in the worst position right now. It seems to be a little bit off this way, and it's a little bit off this way and that way. So rather than me playing around with it and you trying to figure out with me, or you probably knowing exactly what's going on and screaming at me right now, hey dummy, this is what you should do, I'll leave it there. This is a minor problem compared to all of the other stuff we've got done with this chart. So again, that's how you set up a basic bar chart using D3 and React. We'll probably do some more advanced stuff to the chart later on, and maybe give it some animation so that the bars can grow over time, something like that. But for now, we'll leave it there, and in the next video, we'll look at actually doing function graphs, right? So for example, if you have a function like sine of x or x squared, how to graph that, you know, in the same way that maybe you could get the graph using NumPy and Matplotlib in Python. You know, we'd like to be able to do this on our own just using JavaScript. So in the next video, we'll take a look at that. But for this video, as always, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers.